In this session, Ana, Mihika, and myself are going to go through some of the basic results of the global MPI, the International Multidimensional Poverty Index, that is the flagship indicator at OFI. I'm going to explain a little bit what the MPI is and the way it is constructed, what's the data that we use, which are the dimensions, the indicators, and the basic figures. Then Ana is going to present some results on changes over time and inequality among the poor. And finally, Mihika will talk about a new measure of destitution that we launched this year and some urban-rural comparisons based on the global MPI. Now, the global MPI, the international MPI, it's an internationally comparable measure of acute poverty. It was initially launched in 2010 jointly with UNDP and included in the Human Development Report that year, and then it has been updated annually since. Our last launch was in June this year. It was the fourth round of the MPI that has been computed by OFI. Now, the basic methodology that we use to compute the MPI is the Alkire-Foster method, the Alkire-Foster methodology that Ana will go through in the first session after lunch. We will go through all the details and all the components of the final poverty measure. But basically, the global MPI or the international MPI is just a particular application of that methodology. It's just one particular example of what can be done when you choose a particular set of indicators, data sources, weights, cutoffs, and so on. Sometimes people get confused about the global MPI and Alkire-Foster method, thinking that every measure of poverty that is computed with the AF method has to be exactly the global MPI with the same indicators, the same weights, and it doesn't have to be that case. That's why we really wanted to emphasize this from the beginning, and we're going to go through through this example now, and then Ana will present the basic methodology, and then we will have more examples tomorrow about other applications, other adaptations that have been done using the same methodology, but with different dimensions and different cutoffs and particular adaptations. Different countries have already started to use the general methodology to create their own poverty measures with particular dimensions that they're considered to be relevant for the context of their own countries. But again, in the case of the global MPI, the objective is not to be nationally the best measure, but rather to have international comparability. So this limits, in a way, which are the dimensions and which are the cutoffs that we are going to be using. You will see that maybe for a particular country, the cutoff might be too low or too high, or the dimension might not be the best, or there could be other dimensions that for a particular country could be relevant. But again, here we were looking at what could be done for over 100 countries in a comparable way. So when we compute the global MPI, we use basically three types of surveys or three groups of surveys. The main two are actually the demographic and health surveys, which are now funded and coordinated by USAID. In the 2014 round of the MPI, we are actually using 52 DHS surveys, so it's almost half of the surveys that we have in our data bank. Then we are also using 34 mixed surveys, which are carried by UNICEF. And we also have 16 WHS, World Health Surveys. These are a bit old. They were carried between 2002 and 2003. So this is going to be the last wave of the MPI that we're going to include these figures. We are updating them with new data that has become available since. But for 16 of our countries, we are still using WHS data. Additionally, for 6 particular countries, which are mentioned here, Argentina, Morocco, South Africa, Palestine, and Mexico, we are using national surveys because we found that in these particular cases, there were national surveys that allowed to have comparable indicators to those that are available in the other 3 sets of surveys. Now, as you can imagine, there are some constraints in the data that we are using. The first one is being the time period that we are covering. We have data sets coming from 2002, being China, the only one that is actually from 2002. The other WHS are from 2003. And then we have the rest of the data sets are from 2005 onwards. Now we have been able to update a lot of the surveys that we have in our data bank. So 60 of these 108 that we are currently presenting are 2009 onwards. So they are not as old, but we still have different points in times for different countries. At the same time, we are facing some other data constraints. We might have, one of the things that I was mentioning before is that here we are trying to find comparable indicators, comparable dimensions across 100+ countries. And therefore, availability of key indicators in the data was one of our main constraints. When the MPI was originally designed, there was a lot of discussion with UNDP about what would be the indicators to be included in the measure. And there was one of the key things here is that even if we had a list of ideal indicators that we would like to include based on normative decisions and based on what we think that constitutes poverty in each country, then the data sets were, in many cases, they were not including those key indicators. So we were not able to include all the information that we would have liked to have. Then we also have restrictions that have to do with missing values in some surveys, and that also limits the kind of indicators or the final indicators that were chosen when the MPI was initially developed. And at the same time, we have that we don't have information for the same respondent throughout the entire data sets. Even though we are using microdata that goes down to the individual level to ask certain questions, we don't have all the information at the individual level. Some information is at the individual level, some other information is collected at the household level, other information is only collected for women on reproductive age, some other information is only available for children under 5. And that makes it difficult when we want to pick which is the unit of analysis and what is the universe of indicators that we are going to be using for our analysis. Because we don't have all the indicators for every member of the society, we'd rather have them for particular subgroups of the population. And another of the problems is that these data sets are in many cases excluding parts of the population or groups of the population that we consider to be especially vulnerable to poverty, like the elderly or people that are institutionalized, like in a hospital or in prisons, or people living in slums. They are not actually being covered by these surveys, and this, of course, is going to be affecting the final numbers. And at the same time, we have that these surveys are only updated every 3 to 5 years, in some cases even more. For example, one of the most populated countries, India, has been updated in 2005-06, and there is no new data set since then. So we are now using data that is 9 years old, almost a decade old. So all these data constraints are, of course, going to affect the final indicator that we are able to construct. And what you're going to see is that when you are working with your groups, creating your own measures, or when you go back to your countries or to your papers and try to develop your own measure, you're going to find that after deciding which is the goal or the purpose of the measure and picking which will be the ideal indicators, the ideal dimensions that you would like to have in your perfect measure of poverty, then you will go to the data and you will see that sometimes you're not actually able to get that measure, that perfect dimension, or that perfect indicator that you were initially planning to include. And we also face those constraints. Imagine when including 100+ countries, those limitations become even more relevant. But of course, like I was saying, there are a number of countries that are already that have already developed their national measures that we will discuss tomorrow, and some countries that are on the way to releasing their own MPI or their own multidimensional poverty measure. And when you are doing this at the national level, you have more flexibility to add more dimensions that you consider relevant, to adjust the existing surveys or the periodicity of the surveys so that you are able to create a better measure. And basically something that OFI, and not just OFI, but most of the academia has been pushing for recently, is what is called the data revolution, basically demanding for better data. If we had more and better data, more reliable data available, we will be able to have much better indicators, not just on poverty, but in many other social dimensions that are considered to be relevant. So, oops. Okay, so now we're going to go directly into what is the specifics of the global MPI. Basically, in this indicator, in this index of acute poverty, we include 3 dimensions, which are health, education, and living standards, and 10 indicators. We have 2 indicators of health, 2 indicators of education, and 6 indicators of living standards, like are presented here in this diagram. Here in this table over here, we have the specificities of each of these indicators. So in the case of health, for example, the first indicator that we are including is nutrition. And therefore, an individual is considered to be deprived in nutrition if any of the members of the household for which there is available information on nutrition, for which there are anthropometric measures available in the data set, it's undernourished. In some of the surveys, like in mixed data sets, we have information only for children. In DHS, we have information available usually for women in reproductive age and children. And in more recent data, we have now available data also for men and for some additional age groups of women. So we include all the information that is available in terms of nutrition, and well, actually for every indicator in the global MPI. The second indicator is child mortality. That's the second health indicator that we have in the global MPI. And in this case, an individual is considered to be deprived in child mortality if at least one child has died in the household. So basically, if the household has suffered the death of one of the children, every member of the household is considered to be deprived in child mortality. Then we have 2 indicators, as I was saying, for education: years of schooling and child school attendance. In the case of years of schooling, we consider an individual deprived if there is no one in his household that has completed 5 years of schooling or more. So if no one in the household has completed 5 years of schooling, the members are identified as deprived in that indicator. Then in the case of child school attendance, we identify people as being deprived in this indicator if there is at least one school-age child that is not attending school. So here the definition it varies a little bit from country to country, because the age in which a child should be going to school is not always the same. It depends on the country. Some countries, in some countries, compulsory education starts at 5, in others it happens at 6 or 7. So we consider what's the age in which a child should be attending from the 1st to 6th grade of primary school. And then if any child in the household is not attending primary school up to grade 6, then the members of that household are deprived. And then we have the 6 living standard indicators. The first one is whether there is access to electricity. The second one is whether there is access to improved sanitation. Basically, this is following the MDG definition of what is adequate sanitation, and that this sanitation facility is not shared with any other family or any other household. Then we have also an indicator on access to safe drinking water, again following the MDGs definitions, and also considering distance. So we are both considering that the source of drinking water should be safe, but also that the person that is fetching the water should not take more than half an hour, 30 minutes round trip to be able to obtain the water from the water source. And then we have also 3 other indicators. One is about the quality of the flooring. So if the floor is dirt, sand, or dung, the household is considered to be deprived. And then another indicator on cooking fuel. When the household is using solid cooking fuel for cooking, then it's identified as deprived in this indicator. And finally, we have an asset index in which a household is identified as deprived if it has, if it only owns one of the small assets that are mentioned here, which are radio, TV, telephone, bike, motorbike, or refrigerator, and it doesn't have a car. So if the household has 2 of the small assets or a car, it's non-deprived in assets. But if it has only one of the small assets or none, then it is deprived. So basically, these are our 10 indicators. These are the 10 indicators that we were able to obtain in 2010 in a systematic way across 100+ surveys. Now, of course, there are some surveys in which not all of these 10 indicators were available. For example, in Indonesia, we use DHS data and there is no information on nutrition. However, since we have information on the other 9 indicators, we are still computing the MPI using information on those 9 indicators. Now, but most of our countries, in 76 of the countries, we have information for all the 10 indicators that are here in this list. What you have between parentheses in each row is the weight that is assigned to each of the dimensions and to each of the indicators. Basically, yes? You want a mic? No.
Did you apply any statistical methods when you choose these indicators, or did you choose these indicators by using your normative opinions, or did you consider only availability of data?
Yeah.
Or did you make a reliability analysis?
Well, I was not involved in the initial selection of the indicators. This was before my time at OFI. But when it happened, actually, of course, there was a normative discussion about what would be the indicators that we would like to have in a measure. And there were not just within OFI, but since this was a joint discussion with UNDP, with the Human Development Report Office in particular, there was a lot of discussion and interactions with them at the time of selecting the indicators and the cutoffs. Now, this was following normative decisions, but also some international standards like the MDGs. There were some, especially in the case of the living standard indicators, you could see that there are some very direct link between these indicators and indicators that are mentioned in the MDGs. So there were both normative decisions taken by the criteria of what would be ideal indicators to include in a measure, then of course considering international consensus, but then we also went to the data, and this is just one set of indicators that was on trial, but actually there were, I think that first there was a selection of 8 different measures, including different indicators and different weights and different cutoffs, and so UNDP had a big discussion, and also their statistical division was involved in trying to get the best indicators possible. This came back to OFI. There was another set of 5 groups of indicators that were considered, another round of discussion, another 3 sets of indicators, and this is the final measure that was selected. So yes, there was data limitations were essential, of course, but at the same time, before the stage of going to the data and just looking at that, there was a whole discussion of what would be a good measure. Yeah. Yes, the weights. So as you can see here, in this first column over here, all these 3 dimensions have between parentheses 1/3. That's because each of them is given a weight of 1/3. We are weighting the dimensions equally. We are considering them to be equally important when identifying people as poor and non-poor. And then you can see that in the case of nutrition and education, where we have 2 indicators, half of this 1/3 of the weight was split between the 2 indicators that we had available. So we are assigning a weight of 1/6 to each of the health and educational indicators. Now, in the case of living standard indicators, again, this 1/3 of the weight was divided equally into the 6 indicators we were included. So this is the final weight, 1/18, that it's given to each of the indicators. Basically, what we are doing here is that each dimension is given the same weight, and then within dimensions, each indicator is given also the same weight. Now, what would have happened if we have given each of these indicators the same weight, 1/10? Why do you think that we decided to do it this way? I'm sorry? Yes, exactly. So again, this is another normative decision. If we had given each of the indicators 1/10, so they were equally weighted, what you would see is that you would have 20% of the weight going to education, 20% to health and education, and 60% of the MPI would have come from living standard indicators. Now, you could tell me, I think that in my country, living standards are essential when I'm trying to identify poor people, so it's okay, I want to give 60% of the weight to living standard indicators. But here, we were trying to balance each of the dimensions, and the normative decision was that each of them were equally relevant. So we didn't want to create that unbalance between dimensions, okay? Now again, this is another decision that you will have to make with your groups when you're working with data, which is the structure of weights that you want to assign to the different indicators. And this is something that I was mentioning before. There is a clear connection between our MPI indicators and some of the MDGs. There are only 2 of our indicators that have no connection because there is no MDG about them, which are electricity and flooring. But again, we included them because normatively we thought they were relevant. We thought they were important for the countries that we were analyzing. Now, the rest of the indicators have a direct link with some existing MDG. Now, a few things that are also important to consider about the global MPI. The first one is that in all these cases, we are using the same base population. In many of the MDGs, if you go to the UNDP website and you try to check what the status of any country in the different MDGs, what you can see is what the proportion of people that are under the $125 a day poverty line, which is the proportion of people that don't have access to proper sanitation, or what is the proportion of people that don't have access to safe drinking water. But these are looking at different populations. These are looking at different people. You don't know if they are talking about the same people. They might not even be considering the same groups because this data is also coming from different data sources. So it's not the same base population. In the case of the MPI, what we are doing is taking each individual for which we have data on, and we create a poverty profile for that person. So each person in our data has information for the 10 indicators available, and we identify him as deprived or non-deprived in each of them. So that's a big difference with other indicators or with other measures. Now, as I was mentioning before, the data that we are using, the data available for us for our measure, has the limitation that not all the indicators are available for all the people that are included, for all the observations. So for example, in the case of nutrition, we only have anthropometrics for children in mix or for children and women in most of the HS surveys. So we wouldn't have nutritional data for men or for women that are above 49 or below 15, or for households that don't have children. So what we are doing is that it was, again, back when the MPI was initially developed, it was decided that the unit of analysis would be the household. So that's why if we go back to the indicators, to the table of the indicators, you can see that all these indicators are considered at the household level. So it's about whether no child in the household, no one in the household has completed 5 years of education, or if any household member is undernourished, if any child is not attending school. So we are always taking it to the household level. That's the unit of analysis. Now, when we present our final tables, we actually present the reports are done in terms of people, of population, and not at the household. But the unit of analysis is the household. The indicators are defined in that way. Oh. Yes?
But what did you do when you don't have like this nutrition information of one household? How do you attribute that data for that?
If we don't have any information about nutrition for that house, so there are different adjustments that we do. The first case is, for example, when you have a household in which they don't have a school-aged child. So, for example, they are all above 15. And so there is no way that household can be deprived in child school attendance simply because there is no child that should be going to primary school. So the first methodological decision is that that household is considered to be non-deprived in child school attendance. Now, that's a different case for when you have no information at all. Because imagine that for a household, you don't have nutritional information, but somebody could be deprived. Somebody could be undernourished, a child or a woman or a man in that household. Now, in that case, what we do is that we don't consider that household for the final computations. Now, if there is no nutritional information at all in the survey, we compute the MPI, as I was mentioning before, using the other 9 indicators. But at the end, the sample that we keep for the final computations are those households that have non-missing answers, so they have real information for all the indicators.
How do you do that? Because it looks like from what you're saying, you depend on secondary data that's being generated already. The surveys are done by somebody.
Yes.
So how do you really get down now from aggregates to getting down beyond the...
We don't use aggregate data. We use the micro data from the surveys.
So you get the micro
Yes.
questionnaires?
Yes, we have the raw data for each of the surveys.
The surveys?
Yes.
Okay.
And actually, all of these surveys are available online. You just need to register yourself and you can download them, and all the raw data is available. Yes.
Can I ask you
Yes.
quickly, what does it mean that you compute, that the unit of analysis is the household, but then you compute the index at the individual level? If I understand correctly, it means that you compute like the MPI at the household level, and then you assign the poverty profile for that household to each individual in that household. Is that what it means?
Yes. So basically, all the individuals that belong to the same household have the same poverty profile, because they are all either deprived or non-deprived in each one of these 10 indicators. If you have at least one child that is not going to school, it's going to be the same for me, for my sister, for my parents. We are all going to be deprived in that. So yes, we compute the profiles at the household level, and all the members in the household get the same poverty profile. But then when we present the data in our final tables or in our final reports, we don't say which is the proportion of households that don't have access to sanitation, but rather what is the proportion of people that don't have access. And this makes a difference because poor households are usually larger, and so that's going to change. I mean, they represent just one household, but much more people than a non-poor household. So yes, exactly like you said, we have the profile that is exactly the same for each household member, and then the final tables are the percentage of the population. Yeah. Any other comment or question? Yes?
For example, if we're going to use just 9 indicators instead of 10, shall we adjust the weights as well?
Yes. So going back to the table, when we have a data set, well, oh. Yeah, but it's not. Okay. When we have, for example, a survey in which we have 9 indicators, so imagine the case of Indonesia that I was mentioning before. We don't have nutrition, so we don't have it anymore. Now, we still want to assign 1/3 to health, 1/3 to education, and 1/3 to living standards. And then within the dimensions, we still want to weight equally each of the indicators. So nothing's really going to change in these 2 dimensions. Education and standard of living are unchanged. Now, in the case of health, since we don't have this indicator over here, we are going to give the 1/3 of the total weight of the dimension is given to the only available indicator, which is child mortality. So in that case, child mortality receives 1/3 of the final weight. Yes. Yes.
Don't you think that approach will tend to exacerbate poverty? Because the incidence of one person in the household is replicated to all other members of the household, and you're reporting at person's level,
Yes.
not at household level. It tend to increase the number of people.
Yes, yeah, exactly. That's what I was mentioning before. If we are presenting the numbers, just what's the proportion in the population who is deprived in each indicator, or what's the proportion of the population who is identified as MPI poor, and given that poor households are on average larger than non-poor households, then yes, we're going to find that those percentages are higher than if we consider them at the household level. Yes.
It's representative necessarily, because all poverty analysis, even if you use the household, then you get the percentage
Of poverty, of people.
Total against the total population.
Yes, yes, of course.
So you get the same number, actually, still. Yeah. Number of people.
What do you mean?
No, what I mean is, if you do a poverty analysis,
Yes.
you get 30% of the population are poor.
Yes.
That's based on really the households of unit of analysis.
Well, it depends. It depends each analysis. Like if I had information, these 10 indicators for every member of the household, I would be able to create these poverty profiles for each of them.
Yes.
So maybe if I'm undernourished, I will be deprived in nutrition, but maybe my sister, she's not undernourished, and so she wouldn't. And maybe I could be poor, and maybe she's not poor. So it wouldn't be the same. If when we are identifying at the household level, when the unit of analysis is the household, then both of us need to be either poor or non-poor.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
The numbers of what, if you use the household as a unit of analysis, the total population will be bigger than if you disaggregate within the household. The
Yes,
poor
yes,
and
yes.
the non-poor.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's what I'm saying.
Okay, yeah.
So our normal conventional ways of doing poverty analysis might even show higher levels of poverty.
Yeah, I mean,
Because it's the unit of analysis is the household. Finally, if you say 30% of the population are poor, you calculate 30% of the total population of that particular country. It gives you whole sum, household. But with the MPI system structure, you disaggregate at the household level. Within the household, even the household is classified poor,
yes,
but you still have some people who are poor and some who are non-poor.
yes.
So you have the MPI allows you to pull out the poor people and count them individually. So that might even give a lower number. That's what I'm
Okay,
saying.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
But in that case, it depends on how the analysis is done. What I was saying here is that I was comparing when you have the unit of analysis that it's the household, and then the final tables are reported at the individual level.
Yeah.
Which is different from doing the analysis at the individual level, because of course you're identifying all the household members are poor in one case, and in the other you could have some that are poor and some that are not. Yes, of course. Okay. Yes. What what's Okay. Okay, I'll take one more question, but then I need to move on so that we have time for everything before lunch. I mean, we can still go talk about it during lunch or in some of the breaks, if there are more questions.
My question is, please, with this method, is there ways of showing how poor the household is? Because it just looks like it's categorizing if you are poor or not. Just, are you poor, you're not poor? Are there other better ways of categorizing how poor? Because a household of 5 and just one member is not in school cannot be the same with a household where the 5 members are not in school. So I don't know.
Yeah. No, of course. This is not even who's poor and who's not poor. We are on the very first step, and that's why I was saying then I need to move on, because this is just the very first step of the methodology, and there are many other steps later in which we actually see that. So in the first case, what we were doing here is not identifying people as poor or non-poor. We were just saying whether they were deprived in a particular indicator or non-deprived. So for now, all we have is that for each household member, which we know which are the indicators in which they are deprived and which are the indicators for which they have the same achievement, a level of achievement up to the cutoff or even higher. So that's the only thing we've been able to do so far. The next step is actually, once I was able to create these profiles for each household member, how do I identify who's poor and who's not? Now, is it enough to be deprived in just one indicator to be multidimensionally poor? I mean, we have 10. If I'm only deprived in 10, in one, is that enough to be MPI poor or not? Or do I need to be deprived in 10 of them, all of them at the same time, or in 5, or in 6? That's another decision. That's another decision that has to be made. And in the case of the international MPI, the global MPI, we picked what we call a poverty cutoff or a poverty or a K value. You will see this with Anna later today, of 33%. So an individual is considered to be multidimensionally poor when he's deprived in 33% of the 33% or more of the weighted indicators. So it's not enough to be deprived in just one indicator, because if you are deprived in one of the health indicators or the educational indicators, you're only deprived in 1/6. That's around 17%. If you're only deprived in one of the living standard indicators, you're deprived in 1/18, which is 5.55%. All of that is below 33. So basically, to be considered multidimensionally poor, you need to be deprived either in a whole dimension or in one of the health and one of the one of the educational indicator, or in some combination of these 10 indicators that accounts for 33 or more of the weighted score. Now, we have an example here. This is Puba. And in this case, she's deprived in the color indicators. So she's deprived in both of the educational indicators. She's deprived in nutrition, but not in child mortality. And she's deprived in half of the living standard indicators. She's deprived in electricity, in cooking fuel, in electricity, sanitation, and cooking fuel. 34. So basically, she's deprived in 3 indicators that account for 1/6 of the weight, and in 3 indicators that have a weight of 1/18. So if we calculate this, her deprivation, she's deprived in 67% of the weighted indicators. Since this is above our cutoff of 33, this value of 33%, she's identified as multidimensionally poor. Now, again, if a person was only deprived in years of schooling, she would be deprived only in 1/6, in almost 17%. So then she would be identified as non-multidimensionally poor, non-poor. Okay? So this is how we identify. The first step was to identify whether they were deprived or not in each indicator, and then to see whether they are multidimensionally poor if they are deprived in 33 or more of the weighted indicators. Now, I have a whole population, and now I know that some people are poor and some people are non-poor. How do I get my final poverty measure? I still have just a collection of people, some of them belonging to a group, some of them belonging to another. But I actually want an indicator that tells me what's the proportion of poor and how poor they are, like they were asking before. And this is what we have here. This is the final index, the final MPI. The final index, which comes directly from using the Alkire-Foster methodology, it's composed, or it's the product of 2 components. The first one is what we call H, which is the incidence of poverty. It's the proportion of people who are multidimensionally poor. So if this is my entire population, and this group has been identified as MPI poor, and this group is non-MPI poor, basically H is what is the proportion of this group out in the entire population. So maybe say 50% of the population is MPI poor, 40% is MPI poor. So 40% are deprived in 33% or more of the weighted indicators. And this is H. Now, the second component, A, is what we call the intensity of poverty. Basically, what we are considering here is the average number of deprivations that are faced or that are experienced by those who are poor. So now, instead of looking at the entire population, I'm only going to focus on those who are poor. I'm only going to look at them. I'm going to concentrate just on those who are poor. And I'm going to consider which is the average of deprivation they are suffering. Some of them, like Puba, in our example, she was deprived in 67%. And then we might have somebody else that is deprived in 100% of the indicators, somebody else who is deprived in 40% of the indicators. A is just the average of those proportions. It's the average number of deprivations among the poor.
Sorry, in that case, you give a bigger weight to the living standards, don't you? If you just take the average. And if there are more indicators in the living standards, then...
No, because you have already multiplied the indicators. It's not the average. So it's the average weighted number of indicators. So it's not just, you're not counting 6 if he's depriving 6 living standard indicators, but rather he's depriving 1/3. Okay. So it will be the 67% for Puba, and then 100% for somebody else. And for somebody that is deprived in all the living standard indicators, it will be 33%. Okay. And it's the average of that proportion. Yeah. Now, can A be, what's the minimum value for A? Just, yeah. What do you think would be the minimum value for A? What could, I mean, A could be 100 if people are deprived, if all the poor are deprived in everything, then the average would be 100%. Now, if we are only looking, again, we are only looking at those who are poor, right? So we are only looking at people who are, yes, not at everyone, just as those who are identified as poor using this restriction, right? So when I take the average of the deprivations, what's the minimum that we could have? 1/3, perfect. Oh, this is great, you are the best students, because usually people say 0 or 5% because in living standard it's 5%. No, that's perfect, it's 1/3. Because if the people are deprived in less than 1/3, then they are not identified as MPI poor. They don't take part in this average. Again, if we are only looking at people who are deprived in 33% or more, the average has to be between 33% and 100%. It could never go below, right? Good, very good. Okay, so I'm going to skip this, so I'll go directly to this. So now you have the MPI, which is the product of these two terms. Actually, I want to mention this. And the innovation in the MPI, well, not the MPI, the innovation in the Alkire-Foster methodology is that we are not just looking at the head count. We are not just looking at the proportion of poor people, but rather looking also at how poor they are. When we also include the intensity, A, and we adjust the head count by that. Imagine that we have 50% of the population who are poor. We identify them as poor because they were depriving 1/3 of the indicators, all of them. Now, all of a sudden, they become deprived in everything. They are depriving 100% of the indicators. But only that part of the population. For the rest of the population, they were non-poor, and now they are still non-poor. What we're going to find is that the age component, the head count doesn't change. But the intensity is the factor that it's capturing, that it's adjusting the final index to capture the fact that the people that are multidimensionally poor are now poorer than they were before. And this is one of the main advantages or the main features of this methodology. The second big advantage is that it can be broken down and act in a way as a high-resolution lens. Now you have the final MPI, the final index, but it can be broken down by dimension, so we know which is the dimension that is contributing the most to poverty, but we can also decompose it by subgroups to compare women and men, to compare age group, to compare ethnic groups or religions. So basically we can decompose by subgroups in the population, and also by intensity, to see who has the greater intensity from the entire population. So actually, the best way to present data that comes from the Alkire-Foster methodology is to have the indexes, to have the H, A, and M0, or the MPI, but then also present all these additional indices that can be created or that can be computed, breaking it down. So we can actually get all the advantages and all the usefulness of having this kind of measure. We are going to show some examples of how we do this. I'm going to skip some of these slides because they talk about a general example and go directly to the MPI 2014, in which we are actually showing this again, just so that there is enough time for the other topics. So basically, we covered the main MPI methodology. And as I was saying, the MPI was first launched in 2010. And it's been updated in 2011, 13, and 2014. We launched in June, and this year we were able to update 33 of our data sets. We are now included in 108 countries, and we are covering 5.8 billion people, which is 5.4 billion people, which is 78% of the world's population. Besides computing national figures, we are also able to compute subnational, to compare urban-rural figures in 105 countries, and also for 69 countries and 780 subnational regions of the world. And then we also have computed an analysis of changes over time, which was basically led by Sabina and Anna, and she's going to be presenting those figures in a minute. And we also created some new indicator on destitution that I was mentioning before. So out of the 5.4 billion people that we are analyzing in our MPI currently, we identify 30% of them as being MPI poor. So 1.6 billion people in these 108 countries are suffering deprivations in 33% or more of these 10 weighted indicators that compose the MPI. In this map, we are showing the headcount. So this is the proportion of MPI poor by country. It goes from lighter green to dark red. So countries that have light green are the least poor. Then it goes to darker shades of green, light shades of red, and then those who are in this area in sub-Saharan Africa with the darker reds are the countries with the highest proportion of MPI poor. Niger was updated this year using the DHS 2012, and unfortunately it's still the country with the highest proportion of MPI poor. It has 89% of its population that are suffering deprivation in 33% or more of the indicators. But we have now no country that has an incidence that it's above 90%. However, we still find that for 43 of these 780 subnational regions, in those 43 regions, they actually have over 90% of the population in multidimensional poverty. So it's still incredibly high in some parts of the world. Now, in this this pie chart here, we are just showing the population share, how it is these 5.4 billion people, how they are distributed in the different regions of the world. And here we are showing how the MPI poor are distributed in the different regions. So 52% of those 1.6 billion MPI poor live in South Asia, and almost 30%, 29% live in sub-Saharan Africa. And we have also found that 71% of the MPI poor live in middle-income countries. Now, even though they are identified as middle-income countries by the World Bank income groups, they are still concentrating or housing 71% of the MPI poor, showing that sometimes these definitions, income and the MPI, are not talking about the same phenomena. And this graph is also going on that direction, trying to compare these two figures. Basically, what we have here, the height of these bars, is the proportion of people who are MPI poor with our identification method. And so the poorest one is Niger with almost 90%, and the least poor are over here in Europe are Slovakia, Slovenia. And the dots are the $125 a day headcounts of poverty. So this is the proportion of people who are poor based on the World Bank $125 a day poverty line. Now, we are only presenting the dots for those countries in which data on income poverty was available for 3 years before or after our survey, the survey that we are using, so that it was comparable. But basically what we see here is that there is a lot of dispersity, a lot of heterogeneity, and that these two measures are not showing the same figures. They are not showing the same proportion of people being identified as MPI as poor. We have countries in which the headcount of monetary poverty is much higher than the proportion of multidimensionally poor, and for many countries we have that we are identifying much more people as being poor than the traditional monetary measures. Basically, these are complementary measures. These are providing different information, and it's all relevant when we are doing a poverty assessment. The MPI is not here to just substitute the traditional measures of poverty, but rather to provide a different picture, to provide more information about what's the situation in each of these countries. Now here, in this graph, we are basically also comparing income groups by the World Bank categories, and here we have the proportion of people who are identified as MPI poor, so our age or the incidence of poverty, and here we have the average intensity, A. And what we find when we when we start adding up the different income groups by the World Bank is that, of course, we find that there is a larger concentration of low-income countries that also have large levels of multidimensional poverty and large intensity. But we also find countries, for example, in the case of Namibia, I don't know if you're able to see, but Namibia has a green color. It's an upper middle income country. And it's still showing worse results for the MPI than a country like Zimbabwe or Tajikistan even, that is here, which are low-income countries. So, and then we have a country here like, we have countries here that are lower middle-income countries, but are up there just in the region for low-income countries. So basically, again, this is just another way of telling that these are complementary measures and that they are not just saying exactly the same, that we find a lot of diversity. And now I think these are my last slides. This is just to show you these breakdowns or these decompositions that are possible to be done with the MPI. Basically, here we are presenting, this is our national result for Cameroon. This is one of the updated countries in this year. And so here we have the age, the proportion of people who are MPI poor, and in the vertical axis we have the average intensity of poverty in the country. And then we can break it down by subnational region. And this provides much more useful information for policy, because as you can see, there are a lot of differences between these regions over here and north or extreme north, which are much more poor than the national average. So sometimes when we present one basic national number, we could be hiding a lot of diversity, a lot of dispersion, a lot of heterogeneity or inequalities within countries. And that's why it's so important to present all these breakdowns, comparing regions, comparing ethnic groups, and comparing religions. This is just another example for Bangladesh and another example for Ethiopia. And Anna.
So the theme of this year's MPI analysis was leaving no one behind. So let's see what MPI can tell us about, are we taking people, everyone out of poverty, how are we taking people out of poverty? Are we taking the poorest, the less poor? Everyone is moving at the same pace or not? And so me and Sabina and Jose Manuel, we work first on the changes over time. So let's see how the MPI is changing. Are we reducing poverty or not? We studied 34 countries that from every region, and both low-income countries and middle-income countries. These countries represented 2.5 billion of people, and we also covered 338 subnational regions. These are the countries for which there was a recent MPI estimate, as well as a demographic health, DHS health survey that was comparable across time. However, as Adriana pointed out, the global MPI uses all information available in each year. But some countries, the surveys change. So when the survey design changed, we had to standardize the parameters. An example, for instance, nutrition. The first DHS only collected some nutrition, measured the weight and height for children under 5. And then 5 years later, suppose they collect for women as well in reproductive age. The MPI, the global MPI, is going to use all information. When you get like the women, awesome. We have more information on nutrition in the household. However, if I want to compare, I cannot use that information. I would be biased the analysis. So in the second year, I would drop that information and still use only child. So parameters have to be rigorously comparable. Other thing is that, so I have 2 DHS surveys, but the intervals of years between 2 for different countries are different. For instance, Gabon, I think we have 2000 and 2012. So we have 12 years without data. Tanzania, we have 2008 and 2010, so it's only 2 years. To be able to make comparisons across countries, we used annualized change. So we look at the changes per year. So what were the results? Good news is that 30 of our countries have statistically reduced poverty. And these countries represent 98% of the poor on these 34 countries. The countries in red are the ones that did not reduce poverty. And actually, Madagascar seems to increase. Just a note, yes, I didn't explain here the graphs. The horizontal graph gives us the MPI in the first year of the comparison. So countries more to your right are poorer. You can see Niger and Ethiopia are the poorest in this database. Countries to the left are the less poor. Armenia, I think it's the one with lowest poverty in our sample of countries. In the vertical axis, we have the annualized change in the MPI. So how much on average each country reduced poverty. So it means that the ones in the bottom are the ones that performed best, the ones who had biggest reductions. Madagascar actually increased poverty between the years that we are comparing. Oops, sorry. Our top performers are these countries, the ones in the bottom. Actually, Nepal is the one with the highest annualized change in the countries. And what is common to these countries is, with the exception of Bolivia and Ghana, they are all low-income countries. That's also good news. So the low-income countries, apparently should be the poorest, are actually also reduced poverty the most. As Adriana has explained, the MPI is composed by 2 indices. The incidence, yes, please? What time period? Yeah. It's different, so that's a good question. So I'm comparing 2 the surveys for each country, but these surveys are not made in the same years. Like I said, Gabon is 2000, 2012, Tanzania. The maximum and minimum, I think it's 2000 to 2013. 2000, it's only Gabon, I think most of them. Yes, but still, I have to add a caveat. It's not just about the annualized change, because as I'm comparing also different periods of time, the context was different, and so I'm just comparing the numbers, but the truth is, like, the economic context, if I would compare at the same period, my results could have been different. But as there is no data, that we do the best that we can. So the MPI, it's a multiplication, the product of 2 indices. The proportion of poor, H, the incidence, and the intensity of poverty, the average share of deprivations of the poor, among the poor. So we can reduce the MPI, we can reduce poverty in 2 ways, or reducing the percentage of poor, or reducing the deprivations that the poor experiment. So here, what I have in this graph, it's on the horizontal, we have the reduction on incidence, the annualized change on the percentage of poor. On the vertical, we have the annualized change in intensity. And what we found in our 34 countries is that almost every country reduces incidence more than intensity. The exceptions are, one of them it's here, is Ethiopia, that actually had the biggest reduction in the share of the privations, and Niger, countries where strong poverty. And so if you only look at the head count, we miss that they have made great progress. They might not have taken lots of people out of poverty, which Ethiopia actually did, but they have reduced the privations experimented by the poor. Other thing that it's interesting, it's among the top performers, these 10 top performers, it's 10, they both are among the top on both. They both reduced incidence and intensity relatively fast. Nepal being the one with not the maximum on intensity, but close. So the countries more to this corner are the ones that have highest reductions on both. In Ethiopia, as a lower reduction, although it's still on the top performers, but a high reduction on intensity. How poverty has changed. As Adriana also pointed out, we can now go look and decompose this change by dimensions. We can break down the index, the MPI, into these indicators. And we find that 10 of the countries actually have made improvements, reduced their privations in all indicators. In others, sometimes some in ones, not in others. Only 10 in all. But the profiles vary. The thing that was common, like in 32 of the countries, there was statistical improvements in sanitation. That was like the common feature to all. In these, I have like four countries with examples, like Rwanda, big reductions on deprivations on sanitation and drinking water. Ghana is already attendance and sanitation. Tanzania is child mortality and sanitation. Sanitation, yes. Uganda is assets and drinking water. So this varies. The point is, like, different countries reduce poverty using different indicators, like targeting, not necessarily targeting. Besides the dimensional breakdown, we can go and decompose the poverty by subgroups. So we did that for the regions. So each country we go and look to the poverty, not at national level, but in each region. And we found that in 208 of these regions, the poverty statistically went down. And these regions house 78% of the poor. 8 countries reduced poverty in all of their subnational regions: Bangladesh, Bolivia, Gabon, Ghana, Malawi, Mozambique, Niger, and Rwanda. So all regions had significant reductions. Other countries, it means like some regions might have reduced a lot, and other regions might even have increased. We're going to see a little bit about that next. In 9 countries, the poorest region reduced poverty fastest. So that should be good news. Not necessarily all the time. You can also decompose by ethnic group. So here, for countries that we had as information, we went to look at the poverty of the different ethnic groups. And again, on the horizontal axis, you have the MPI in the first period, and on the vertical, the change per year. And this is Benin. What we see in Benin, and the size of the bubble is the percentage of poor in that group. What we see in Benin, actually in Benin we see something that it's not a nice picture. We see that the poorest ethnic group actually has not reduced poverty. So the biggest reductions on poverty were in the groups that were less poor. Oops, sorry. So this group is being left behind. This is the poorest group and is not reducing poverty, while the others are reducing. So it's going to start lagging behind. For Kenya, we see a different picture. We see that actually the Somali, the poorest group, for a stretch, are reducing poverty fastest than everyone else. So they are catching up. How would this picture change? So I'm talking about changes in multidimensional poverty. How would this change if instead of talking of multidimensional poverty, I will be talking about income poverty? So in this graph, I have the MPI incidence, the change this is in percentage points, of the MPI incidence, of the age, of the proportion of people who are poor per year, and the change on the $1.25 a day incidence. And what does this graph show? For instance, Nepal, our top performer. It's still, like it reduces both pretty fast. It made big improvements in both income poverty, reduced the number of people living with less than $1.25 a day, but it also reduced the people MPI, percentage of MPI poor. Next, the Rwanda, Ghana, and Bolivia, they actually reduced MPI poor around 2 to 3 times faster than the income poverty. So here, it's not the same. If we look to the income, they are performing okay. But if we look to the MPI incidence, they are performing good. They are our top. Then it can happen the opposite, like Niger. If you look at the income, Niger, Mozambique, Uganda, and Cambodia, if you look at the income, it seems like they are doing great progress. But if you look to the MPI, not that much. And then there is even the case of Nigeria and Zambia, where they go in different directions. So if you look at the income, it seems like poverty is not reducing, it's increasing. But if you look to the MPI poor, no, the MPI poor is reducing. The point being, for instance, is that we should also look at the MPI poor. If we don't look at the multidimensional poverty, the progress in these 3 countries would be invisible. Because we would look at the income, okay, but no, they have been reducing poverty. They have been reducing the deprivations experimented by people. So that was about changes over time. There will be another session more accurate about these changes over time later next week. Now, inequality among the poor, and this is work from Schumann and Sabina. So if you have more questions, oh, sorry.
Just a little technical question. In the last slide, the changes in the income in poverty and the MPI poverty are for the same periods?
Very good question. Very good question. I didn't cover. Again, no. No, not actually. No, it's not. No, some countries it is. So what we did, it's like I look at the countries that I had for each year. For instance, Niger. I see the year that I had my first survey and the second. And I try to look on the World Bank database if they have the income information for that years. And lots of them actually have. But when they had, I did interpolate. So if they didn't have for 2005, but they had for 2004 and 2008, I assume a linear decrease, in most of the cases, in Niger, no increase, decrease. And I interpolate. When there was no possibility of interpolation, I used the closest. So sometimes I didn't have 2 points, I only have 1, I use the closest.
And they come from different surveys?
Yes, because I wish we had more surveys with both information, the analysis could be much richer. No, okay. Yes, so what's first slide?
Just one comment. It would be useful if the GDP growth rates are reported.
Actually, we did that analysis as well about the correlation. I didn't present it.
To see the relationship between the measures. And
Yes, it changes. So we computed the elasticity of the reduction in multidimensional poverty with respect to growth, and it changes. And I didn't present it here because this is the most direct. This is only income. But it's a good point. It's analysis we can discuss later.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, I was just asking about, because you mentioned two sources of data.
Yes.
One, you talked about maybe data has to be collected from well-recognized bodies. And then you also mentioned about data being collected from national level, particularly for Latin American countries.
Yes.
I don't know whether that's acceptable globally to collect data from the national countries, because then it means you're accepting it for Latin America, maybe because you rely too much on their statistical strengths in doing analysis, and in other countries maybe you doubt their capability in doing it. That's why you have to get it from either the World Bank or somewhere. Because I really come from the Gambia, when you talked about these sources of, I looked at the MPI for Gambia. I downloaded it, and I really discovered that most of the data used were really absolute data, very old data. And really, we did a DHS recently, as you've rightly said, funded by USAID. Macro did it, just like Macro is well recognized. The last MIS, which was also done by UNICEF. And also we did a poverty study, national poverty study. There is new data available, but I don't know really what's the process in really getting the data accessible to you people.
So,
yeah.
Because I'm going to go fast on this other data, because on Thursday we'll have a class just to, there will be covering data sources. But here, so the MPI, we try to cover like international comparable. And most of the countries we are using surveys that are international and that are available. There was countries, national countries, and it's that we saw the surveys were available and we found them they were comparable. And there is that analysis. You look at the data, you see, and you choose. But it's just 6 countries. So our standard is to use the DHS and the mix that are comparable. But might cover to talk more on this Thursday. I'm sorry, like there is someone, just the last question. In the end, lunchtime, we can talk.
It's a very brief question. I was wondering if you have tried to include the monetary dimension into the MPI, and if you haven't, then what was the reason you did not include it as one of the indicators inside the MPI?
Good question. No, because we have no data. You have to have the data for all the deprivations for the same person. And what we found when we were talking is that there are no data, that surveys that cover dimensions, non-income dimensions, and income. There are no, like, a big set that we could compare, there isn't. However, tomorrow we're going to see the case application of the Alcaire-Foster methodology in Mexico, and they do that. They have their data, they have income, they have the deprivations, they put it all together. Next, at lunchtime. Because we have... so as I was saying, Schumann looked at the inequality. He started to look at the inequality among the poor. So they computed a new measure of inequality among the poor for 90 countries with data from 2005 to 2013. Highest levels of inequality among the poor, I'm just talking about inequality among the poor, are found in sub-Saharan African countries, South Asia, Yemen, and Somalia. The greatest inequality among the poor is Burkina Faso. He also looked for the 30 countries that I was mentioned before at the change in the inequality. And good news again, most countries, the reduction on poverty also was translated into a reduction in inequality. So it seems like there is hope. Why is it important to look at inequality at this measure? Suppose here Egypt and Suriname, they have the same MPI and very similar head counts and intensity. However, when we look to the poor, these spies are the poor, only the poor. And each of these slices, it's the proportion of the poor that have deprivations between 33.3 and 39.9. So it's the lowest deprivation range of deprivations that poor can have. As Adriana pointed out, poor always have at least 1/3. That's what makes them poor, identify them as poor. So each of these slices, it's for different ranges. The lightest is with lowest level of poverty to the darkest with the poverty between, there is here like 80 to 89%. What this pie shows, in Egypt, more than half of the poor have deprivations above 49.9. So more than half of the poor are deprived in 1/2 or more of the deprivations, of the indicators. While in Suriname, no. It's like more than half, actually, I wouldn't say, I don't know, 65, 70% of the people have low deprivation. They are in the closest to non-being deprived, only between 33%, 33.3, and 39. So it's different. So there is like some story here to be told. And when you go look at changes over time, so here we are again only looking at the poor. The first column is the percentage of poor people with this range of deprivations, 33 to 39.9, and the second in the first year of the comparison, and the second in the second year. So what we see here, that in the groups of the poor with highest deprivations, 70% or more, they have reduced. So we're talking about IT. IT has reduced the percentage of people that experiment lots of deprivations, a big share of deprivation. This is good news. Sometimes there is not so good news. India, no. India, they practically no change. The percentage of people with high deprivations remains the same. But you can go deeper. You can look more to the groups, not just to the national average. And when you look at the groups, you see that there is Karnataka actually reduced. But if you look to the average, you cannot see that improvement because there are countries like groups, or Bihar, where it reduced on one, but it increased on the highest share. Increased the percentage of people with deprivations within 90 and being deprived in all. Schumann also looked to the subnational disparity. So instead of looking just to the poor, let's look how the poverty is different across regions. And he found of the temporal analysis that 15 countries have reduced disparity among regions. So the MPI was getting more similar across the regions. They converge. 15 showed no change on disparity. And India increased disparity. Here are some graphs. And so in the horizontal is the MPI at the first year of the comparison, and the vertical is the change per year. In Egypt, it's again what you see, the poorest region has decreased the most. India, the poorest region, it was not the one that reduced poverty the less, but almost. So this is the point of these graphs. And now I pass to you. Thank you. I'll see you in the afternoon.
So I will not take too much of your time because then you would be deprived in nutrition. So I'm just going to quickly go through these slides. So what we try to do is also look at the share of MPI poor who live in rural areas, because there is this general belief, and the number that is generally thrown around using income poverty or monetary poverty measures is that around 70% of the poor live in rural areas. So we try to do something similar this year with the MPI data. And what we find is, so here we have the regions using the World Bank regional groupings. And what we find is that 85% of the MPI poor people live in rural areas. And what we are really looking at is the head count ratio of MPI poor. So we are looking at the percentage of MPI poor people who live in rural areas. And that's 85%. And what is interesting to see is that if we use income measures using national poverty lines, and when we have national poverty lines, we usually, in many countries, we have a rural poverty line and then urban poverty line, which is slightly differentiated in many countries. And if we use national income poverty lines, we find that 71% of the people for those same countries, which is 170 countries, so here we are looking at a sample of 107 countries, excluding China, because we had some data constraints in China. 71.4% of the people live in rural areas using the national income poverty lines. Just wanted to quickly point out that we have very different results for the Latin American countries. That group has drastically different results if we use MPI poverty versus income poverty based on national poverty lines. So the difference is as large as, it's between 36% and 70%. And one thing to note is that the MPI poor, when we use that measure, it uses the same exact indicators, the same exact deprivations for urban
and rural people. So when we use the same exact deprivations, we see that the proportion of people living in Latin America in rural areas is much higher than what we find using national income poverty lines. So that was the point of that quick illustration, but of course also the point was to show that you can look at the MPI through rural versus urban and different subgroups, as has been already been shown in the presentation. Quickly wanted to talk about a new measure that we have started, which is the destitution. One can really think of if the global MPI is an application of the Alkire-Foster methodology, the destitution measure is an extension of that application. So we implement this measure for 49 countries, which house about 2.8 billion people. And what we are really doing with this measure is that we are going deeper into the deprivations. It uses the same 10 indicators as the MPI. It uses the same weights and the same poverty cutoff for identifying the poor. But what we are doing is that for each deprivation or for each indicator, we have a slightly more severe deprivation cutoff. So that's what we are doing with the destitution measure. So just to show you that this is the MPI measure, if we look at these are the deprivation cutoffs for the MPI measure for every indicator. So if this was the deprivation cutoff in the case of the MPI, and if this is the poverty cutoff, which is 33.3% for the MPI, this is what we have as the people identified as MPI poor. So this is our group of MPI poor people. What we are doing with destitution is that with the indicator, within the indicator, we are just using a more severe cutoff, a more stringent cutoff to identify the poorest of the poor amongst the MPI poor. And what we really find is a subset of the MPI poor who are obviously MPI poor but are also destitute. But if you see that they're also, they're still deprived in 33.3% of at least 33.3% of the weighted domains, but that the domains, the deprivation cutoffs are much deeper. Okay. So just to give you an example, I'm not going to go through this entire list because it's all there on our website and we are going to discuss this more. But so in the case of MPI, let's use attendance as an example. So in the case of attendance in the MPI, if at least one child was not attending school within the first 8 years of universal or compulsory education, we identified the household as MPI or deprived in that indicator. In the case of destitution, what we are doing is that if all primary school age children who are supposed to be attending the first 6 years of education, if they are not in school, then we identify the person living in the household as deprived in that indicator. So we have the indicator, we have the deprivation cutoff, and for the destitution we have a more severe deprivation cutoff. So that's what we are doing. So another example is water, which is very easy to think about. In the case of water, we had, if a person would be considered deprived if they lived in a household where they did not have access to safe water within 30 minutes. In this case, you have to walk 45 minutes to access safe water. So what we are essentially doing is thinking of a more severe form of poverty. So what we find is half of the MPI poor people are destitute, and of these destitute, 97.3% of the people live in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And of the destitute, half of them live in India. Of course, the thing to remember here is that India's data is a bit dated, but over half of them, around 430 million destitute, live in India. And so the other, and we can also look at the different areas in which the destitute are divided across the world, and we do find that it is the percentage of people who are MPI poor are mostly focused in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And just to quickly show you a comparison between destitution and $1.25 a day measure. So on the x-axis, we have the percentage of population that are poor by the $1.25 a day poverty, and on the y-axis, we have the percentage, so the head count of the destitute. And what we really find is very interesting, and it's similar to what we have been seeing, the general sort of mismatch between $1.25 a day and MPI poverty, which we have already seen. But here's an example where Swaziland and Niger, they both are similar in terms of the number of people who are living below the $1.25 day poverty. However, they have drastically different proportions of people who are identified as destitute. And that ranges between 8% in Swaziland and 69% in Niger. And again, there's also a sort of another kind of disparity where we have Cameroon and Haiti that have very similar proportions of people who are destitute, but drastically different proportions of people who are identified by the $1 to $1.25 a day poverty line. And again, the range is 10 to 69%. But the good news is, again, we see that a lot of the poor countries are the ones that are reducing destitution faster. And some of the countries are Ethiopia, Niger, Nepal, and Bolivia, but the Ethiopia has emerged as a champion. Again, like the MPI poverty, we also see that the least developed countries and the low-income countries are doing the best at tackling destitution. And in the case of Ethiopia, we see that the percentage of the people who are destitute has gone down by 30 percentage points in 11 years. The change was more prominent in the years between 2000 and 2005 compared to 2005 and 2011. And I'm not going to go through this in very detail, but the thing to note is that Ethiopia has done remarkably well in reducing destitution in rural areas compared to urban areas. And given that about 80% of Ethiopian population lives in rural areas, that speaks well, because it means that there is a catch-up amongst the people who live in rural areas. So that is important. And just quickly, in case you are wondering how it is that Ethiopia has developed the story of change, this is in between 2000 and 2005, we see that in every indicator, whether it is the uncensored headcount or censored headcount, and we will go through this in the afternoon so you'll have a better idea, but censored headcount is basically people who are destitute and are deprived in these areas, in these indicators. We see that there is a reduction across all indicators, and they were mostly all statistically significant. And between 2005 to 2011, the reduction was smaller, but Ethiopia has done particularly well in water and sanitation. So just to close, MPI does provide a very high resolution lens, and there's a lot of information on our website. We have stories, and we have poverty profiles, we have infographics, and we have an interactive data bank, which is really, really helpful if you want to download data, if you want to interact with the data, and a lot of the graphs that we produce can easily be replicated using our interactive data bank. That was 10 minutes, so I think we are done, and then we can go for lunch.